The letter arrived in Philadelphia on a Tuesday morning in November 1869. It was addressed to a mining executive named James Pritchard. Inside, 3 sentences written in elegant script read, "The coal you seek is there, precisely where I indicated, 20 feet beneath the southern ridge. You will find it abundant and accessible, exactly as my survey promised. I hope you invest everything you have." The signature at the bottom read simply Property Lot 37. By the time Pritchard understood what those words meant, he had already staked his entire fortune on the Pennsylvania coal field the letter referenced. By the time he realized he had written them, his creditors were foreclosing on everything he owned. And by the time he learned the truth about that coal, about the sulfur contamination that made it commercially worthless despite its abundance, the woman who had engineered his destruction had vanished again, leaving behind only the memory of a price paid 12 years earlier on a Richmond auction block. $20,000, the equivalent of nearly $400,000 in modern currency, the highest sum ever recorded for a single human being sold into slavery in the American South. This is not a story about that sale, though we will return to it. This is a story about what happened after, about the woman who walked away from that auction beside her purchaser and disappeared into the Blue Ridge Mountains for 3 years, only to emerge as something her former owners never imagined possible. A weapon precise, patient, and absolutely merciless. This is a story about revenge served cold across a decade, about knowledge weaponized against those who believed they owned it, and about the single most expensive mistake ever made by men who thought human beings could be bought and sold like livestock. The mistake of believing that purchasing someone's labor meant controlling what they knew, what they remembered, and what they would eventually do with both. Before we continue, we need to understand something together. Stories like this one, stories about people who were systematically erased from history, who survived through intelligence and strategy rather than submission, these stories matter. They show us what resistance looks like when rebellion means death. Subscribe to the Fear Sermon right now. Hit that notification bell because what you're about to hear was deliberately buried for more than a century, and channels like ours exist to excavate exactly these kinds of truths. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We want to know how far this story reaches. Now, let us begin where the mystery truly starts. Not with the auction, but with the bankruptcy. James Pritchard was not a stupid man. That is important to understand. He had built a mining empire across 3 states through calculated risk and ruthless efficiency. He knew geology. He knew markets. And he knew when to trust his sources. So when he received a survey report in early 1869 from a geological consultant in Philadelphia, someone with an impeccable reputation for accuracy, someone whose previous surveys had led him to mineral deposits that generated spectacular profits, he did not hesitate. The report detailed a property in Pennsylvania's coal country, a tract of mountain land available for a price that seemed almost too reasonable. The survey indicated vast coal seams at accessible depths, quality sufficient for industrial use. Pritchard purchased the land, invested in equipment, hired workers, and began extraction operations within 2 months. The coal was exactly where the survey indicated, 20 feet beneath the southern ridge, abundant and accessible, precisely as promised. The first loads came out of the ground looking perfect, black and dense and ready for market. Then the buyers began returning it. The coal burned, yes, but it produced sulfurous smoke that ruined furnaces and sickened workers. Chemical analysis revealed contamination levels that made the entire deposit commercially worthless. Every ton extracted represented pure loss. Pritchard had spent everything. His investors demanded repayment. His creditors foreclosed. By December 1869, the mining empire he had spent 2 decades building collapsed into bankruptcy, and James Pritchard found himself standing in a Philadelphia office staring at the consultant who had provided the survey, demanding to know how such a catastrophic error could occur. The consultant sat behind a desk, hands folded, expression calm. "I made no error, Mr. Pritchard. My survey reported exactly what exists beneath that property. Abundant coal at accessible depth. The fact that you failed to request additional analysis regarding sulfur contamination is not my responsibility." Pritchard's face had gone purple with rage. "You knew. You had to know." The consultant's expression never changed. "I knew precisely what I was paid to know. You hired me to locate coal. I located coal. Perhaps you should have hired someone more thorough. Or perhaps, Mr. Pritchard, you should have been more careful about who you purchased 12 years ago in Richmond. The color drained from Pritchard's face. The consultant stood, gathering papers with movements that suggested the meeting had concluded. My name was never Anna, though that is what they called me during your geological expeditions in Virginia. My name was never Lot 37, though that is how I was sold. My name was never property, though that is what your bill of sale claimed. What my name actually is, you will never know. But you will remember me every day for the rest of your life as you live in the poverty you imposed on others. Consider it payment for 3 years of my labor you never compensated. Consider it interest on the $20,000 you paid, thinking you owned what I knew. The consultant walked to the door, paused, and looked back one final time. The coal is there, Mr. Pritchard, exactly where I said. I never lied about that. I simply allowed you to assume that valuable and profitable meant the same thing. Good day. James Pritchard died in poverty 5 years later, having lost everything. But his bankruptcy was not random misfortune. It was the culmination of a campaign of calculated destruction waged by a woman who had spent years mapping every man, every company, every fortune built on her stolen expertise. Pritchard was not the first. He was simply the most dramatic, and his collapse finally drew attention to a pattern that should have been obvious years earlier if anyone had been looking. If anyone had thought to ask what happened to the woman who sold for an impossible price on March 14, 1857. If anyone had wondered where she went after she vanished into the mountains with the man who called himself Marlowe, whose real name was Pritchard, who paid $20,000 for knowledge he believed he could control. But we are moving too quickly. To understand how a woman engineered the destruction of a mining empire from Philadelphia in 1869, we must first understand what made her worth $20,000 in Richmond in 1857. We must understand what knowledge she possessed, how she acquired it, and why men with fortunes were willing to gamble everything to own her. The story begins not with the auction, but with a dead man's library and a wife who defied her husband's orders in ways that would reshape American mining economics a decade later. Colonel Thaddeus Harrove owned a moderately successful plantation outside Charlottesville, Virginia. He was not particularly wealthy by Virginia standards, not particularly influential, not particularly remarkable in any way except one. He maintained an extensive personal library focused on geology, mineralogy, and surveying techniques. Harrove fancied himself an amateur scientist. He corresponded with academic geologists, subscribed to technical journals, and occasionally accompanied survey expeditions into Virginia's western mountains. Though his contributions were financial rather than practical, his library contained more than 300 volumes, including rare European texts on mineral identification and American survey manuals detailing techniques for predicting subsurface formations from surface indicators. His wife, Elizabeth Harrove, possessed something her husband lacked, a conscience. She detested slavery, though she lacked the courage or means to oppose it openly. Instead, she engaged in small acts of rebellion, teaching enslaved women in her household to read, providing access to books, encouraging intellectual development in direct violation of Virginia law and her husband's explicit commands. Among the women Elizabeth taught was someone she called Anna, approximately 16 years old when she arrived at the Harrove plantation in 1843, purchased from an estate sale after a previous owner's death. Anna had been born into slavery, had spent her childhood in field work, and demonstrated nothing remarkable until Elizabeth began teaching her. Then something became apparent. Anna possessed what modern psychology would identify as eidetic memory, the ability to recall visual information with photographic precision. She could read a page once and recite it verbatim weeks later. She could observe a landscape and reproduce its features in exact detail months afterward. More significantly, she demonstrated spatial reasoning abilities that allowed her to visualize complex three-dimensional relationships, understanding how geological formations extended beneath visible surfaces, how patterns repeated across distance, how subtle surface indicators revealed what lay hidden below. Elizabeth Harrove recognized this ability immediately. She gave Anna access to her husband's geological library. For 4 years, Anna read everything. Technical manuals written for professional surveyors, academic treatises on mineral formation, practical guides to identifying coal seams, iron ore deposits, limestone formations. She absorbed it all with perfect recall, understanding not just the words but the underlying principles, the relationships between surface features and subsurface reality, the patterns that repeated across different geological contexts. She taught herself to read landscapes the way others read books, seeing beneath the visible surface to the valuable formations hidden below, and Elizabeth encouraged it, believing perhaps that intellectual development represented a form of resistance, a way of asserting humanity in a system designed to deny it. In 1847, Colonel Harrove discovered his wife's transgression. He found Anna reading in his library, surrounded by his most valuable geological texts. His rage was immediate and absolute. He beat his wife severely enough to confine her to bed for 3 weeks. He prepared to sell every enslaved woman his wife had taught, including Anna, immediately and without consideration for price. Then something stopped him. Before the sale could be finalized, a geological survey expedition led by Professor William Barton Rogers arrived in Charlottesville, seeking local labor for a 6-month mapping project in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The expedition needed workers to carry equipment, dig test pits, and process ore samples. Harrove, still furious but also calculating, made a decision that would ultimately cost other men fortunes. He offered Anna's services to Rogers's expedition, not as field labor, but as someone who might contribute more specialized assistance. Rogers was skeptical. He was a professional geologist educated at William and Mary, founder of what would become MIT. The idea that an enslaved woman could contribute meaningfully to scientific survey work seemed absurd, but Harrove was insistent, offering Anna's labor at a nominal rate that made refusal difficult. Rogers agreed to a trial period of 1 week. If she proved useful, he would continue her employment for the full 6-month expedition. If not, she would be returned with no further obligation. Anna spent that week demonstrating abilities that would haunt Rogers for the rest of his life. He would write about it decades later in a privately circulated memoir, describing how she could predict with uncanny accuracy where mineral deposits would be found simply by observing surface rock formations, drainage patterns, and vegetation distribution. She could not explain her reasoning in technical language, Rogers noted, but her predictions proved correct with a frequency that exceeded even my own professional assessments. By the end of the first week, Rogers insisted on retaining her services for the entire expedition. By the end of 6 months, he had offered Colonel Harrove substantial payment to purchase Anna's freedom so she could receive formal scientific training. Harrove refused absolutely. The conversation ended with threats of legal action if Rogers ever contacted his property again. But word had spread. Other geological survey operations heard about the enslaved woman who could read terrain like a surveyor with decades of experience. Requests came to hire her services. Harrove, recognizing an opportunity, began renting Anna to survey expeditions across Virginia, charging rates that exceeded what field workers earned by significant margins. Between 1847 and 1853, Anna participated in at least 7 major geological surveys, each one expanding her practical knowledge, each one demonstrating her abilities to more people, each one increasing the number of men who understood exactly how valuable she could be. Then in 1853, Colonel Harrove died suddenly. His will made no specific provisions for Anna. She became part of the estate inventory, listed alongside furniture and livestock. 18 enslaved people total. No individual names recorded, only ages and general descriptions. The estate executor, a distant cousin named Marcus Penfield, faced significant debts. He needed to liquidate assets quickly. But Penfield had heard the stories about Anna's geological expertise. He knew men in the mining industry who would pay substantial sums for reliable survey intelligence. So he made a different calculation. Rather than selling Anna quickly to satisfy creditors, he attempted to maximize her value. Penfield spent 3 years after Harrove's death renting Anna's services to every geological operation, mining company, and land speculator willing to pay. She surveyed properties across Virginia, Tennessee, possibly Kentucky. She identified coal seams, iron ore deposits, limestone formations, always with the same unsettling accuracy. Men who hired her once invariably tried hiring her again. Companies competed for her time. Her reputation spread beyond Virginia into the broader mining industry that stretched from Pennsylvania to Alabama. And Marcus Penfield grew wealthy from the proceeds, charging rates that kept increasing as demand intensified. But by 1857, Penfield faced a problem. Anna was 30 years old, and her continued profitability depended on her remaining healthy and cooperative. He had no legal obligation to treat her well, but he needed her functional. Meanwhile, mining companies were pressuring him to sell, offering substantial sums for permanent ownership rather than temporary rental. The tension between short-term profit from rentals and long-term profit from a single massive sale finally resolved itself when one particular buyer made an offer Penfield could not refuse, not just a price, but a strategy, a performance designed to drive competitive bidding beyond anything the Richmond market had ever witnessed. The buyer's name was James Pritchard, though he would present himself at the Richmond Exchange as J. Marlowe. He was a land speculator who had spent 3 years searching for exactly what Anna represented, reliable geological intelligence that could identify valuable properties before competitors recognized their worth. Pritchard had employed professional geologists, none of whom matched the accuracy he needed. Then he heard about Anna. He tracked her employment history, interviewed men who had used her services, verified her abilities through testimony from sources he trusted. When he approached Marcus Penfield with a proposal, he did not simply offer to purchase. He offered to stage the purchase in a way that would justify an astronomical price while simultaneously creating mystery that would prevent future questions. The sealed letter, the anonymous seller, the sworn attestation about knowledge verified by witnesses, the opening bid of $5,000. Every element was theater designed to transform a routine auction into something extraordinary, something that would command attention and justify a price that would otherwise seem insane. Pritchard knew that men with fortunes made irrational decisions when confronted with mystery and competition. He knew that creating the appearance of multiple desperate buyers would drive prices beyond reason. He orchestrated the entire performance. And when his final bid of $20,000 crashed over the Richmond Exchange like thunder, no one questioned it. They simply accepted that something impossibly valuable had been purchased by someone willing to pay an impossible price. But here is what none of them understood. The price was not irrational. $20,000 for 3 years of Anna's geological expertise used to identify and acquire mineral rights across Appalachia would generate returns that made the investment trivial. Pritchard knew exactly what he was buying. He knew exactly how to extract maximum value. And he believed absolutely that ownership meant control, that paying $20,000 gave him the right to Anna's knowledge, her labor, her complete cooperation for however long he chose to use her. He was wrong about that last part. Catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, and that error would eventually cost him everything. Anna walked out of the Richmond Exchange on March 14, 1857, beside James Pritchard, her shackles removed, her expression revealing nothing. They traveled northwest into the Blue Ridge Mountains, arriving at a remote property Pritchard had purchased near Swiftern Gap. He had prepared a cabin, modest but functional, isolated from any settlement. Here he intended to conduct his survey operations using Anna's knowledge to identify valuable land parcels he could acquire cheaply and sell to mining companies at enormous profit. He believed he had planned everything perfectly. He had purchased the most valuable geological intelligence available. He had isolated her where she could not escape, where her knowledge could be exploited without interference. He had established the terms of their arrangement clearly. She would survey properties he selected. She would identify mineral deposits with the accuracy her reputation promised. She would receive basic necessities, shelter, and food, nothing more. In return, he would not sell her further. This would be her final owner. Simple, transactional, profitable for him. What Pritchard failed to understand, what every man who had ever employed Anna's expertise failed to understand, was that knowledge creates leverage. That someone who knows where wealth is buried possesses power beyond what legal ownership can control. That a woman who had spent 13 years learning to read the earth, who had memorized every geological formation across 3 states, who understood exactly which men had profited from her stolen expertise, and exactly how to destroy them, such a woman was not property. She was a weapon waiting for the moment when her chains would fall away and the debt could be collected. That moment was coming, not immediately, but inevitably. Because James Pritchard had made the same mistake as every other man who purchased human beings believing intelligence could be owned. He assumed that paying money meant gaining control. He assumed that legal documents meant genuine power. He assumed that isolation meant safety. Over the next 3 years in those mountains, Anna would teach him exactly how wrong those assumptions were. Not through rebellion, but through perfect cooperation. Not through resistance, but through absolute compliance. She would give Pritchard everything he paid for, every survey, every mineral deposit, every geological formation he requested. She would make him wealthy beyond his wildest calculations. And in doing so, she would forge the weapon that would eventually annihilate him and everyone else who had prospered from her bondage. The first survey James Pritchard requested took place in late March 1857, less than 2 weeks after the Richmond auction. He had acquired maps of 3 properties in Augusta County, each one available for purchase at prices suggesting the current owners saw no particular value in mountain land suitable only for marginal timber operations. Pritchard spread the maps across the cabin's rough table and explained what he wanted: coal, iron ore, limestone formations, anything that could be extracted and sold. He needed to know which property, if any, justified investment. Anna studied the maps in silence. These were crude documents, hand-drawn by county surveyors, showing boundaries and basic topography, but little else. After several minutes, she spoke for the first time since leaving Richmond. "I need to see the land. Maps show only surfaces. What you want lies beneath." Pritchard had anticipated this. He had purchased a horse for himself and arranged for Anna to walk alongside as they traveled. The first property lay 8 miles distant, accessible by logging roads that climbed into hills where spring had not yet fully displaced winter. They reached it by mid-afternoon, and Pritchard watched as Anna did something that would become familiar over the following months, something that seemed simultaneously methodical and inexplicable. She walked the property boundary slowly, pausing periodically to examine exposed rock faces where erosion or previous logging had revealed underlying formations. She knelt beside streams, studying how water had cut through layers of sediment and stone. She observed vegetation patterns, noting where certain plants clustered and where others refused to grow. She examined slopes, measuring with her eyes alone how drainage worked, where water collected, where it flowed away. She spent 3 hours conducting this inspection, while Pritchard grew increasingly impatient, demanding explanations she did not provide. Finally, as afternoon shadows lengthened, she returned to where he waited with the horse. "There is coal beneath the northeastern section," she said, her voice carrying no emotion, no inflection. "A seam perhaps 4 feet thick running northwest to southeast, accessible at depths between 15 and 30 feet depending on terrain. The quality will be adequate for industrial use. Iron ore exists along the western boundary following a ridgeline, but the deposits are scattered and extraction would require significant investment relative to yield. This property has value, but only if purchased cheaply and developed gradually." Pritchard pressed for more details, demanding to know how she could be certain without excavation. Anna's response was simple. "Dig where I indicate. You will find what I describe. If I am wrong, you may do whatever you wish with me. If I am correct, you will pay me nothing beyond what you have already paid, and we will continue this arrangement until you decide otherwise. Those are the terms you established. I am merely fulfilling them." Pritchard did not dig that day. He visited the second property where Anna conducted a similar inspection and declared it worthless for mineral extraction. The third property received her highest recommendation: substantial coal deposits, accessible depth, superior quality. Pritchard purchased the third property for $1,200 2 weeks later, then hired local workers to conduct test excavations exactly where Anna had indicated. The coal was there. 4-foot seam running northwest to southeast, accessible depth, industrial quality, exactly as described. Within 6 months, Pritchard sold the mineral rights to a Pennsylvania mining company for $8,000. His investment of $1,200 plus the workers' wages returned nearly 6 times its cost. And this was only the first of dozens of similar transactions he would complete over the next 3 years. The pattern established itself quickly. Pritchard identified available properties through land agents, speculators, and county records. Anna surveyed them, providing detailed assessments of what lay beneath. Pritchard acquired those with the greatest potential at the lowest cost, then immediately resold mineral rights to mining operations willing to pay substantial premiums for reliable intelligence about deposits they could exploit profitably. The system worked flawlessly because Anna's predictions never failed. Not once in 3 years did her geological assessments prove inaccurate. Test excavations always found what she promised, where she promised, in the quantities she specified. Pritchard's reputation among mining companies grew rapidly. He became known as someone with uncanny ability to identify valuable properties before competitors recognized their worth. His wealth accumulated with remarkable speed. But something else was happening simultaneously, something Pritchard never noticed because his attention remained fixed on profit. Anna was documenting everything, every property surveyed, every mineral deposit identified, every mining company that purchased rights, every man who profited from her assessments. She could not write her observations down, obviously. Pritchard searched the cabin periodically, ensuring she possessed no materials for documentation. But Anna did not need paper. Her memory was perfect. She recorded everything visually, spatially, creating detailed mental maps that tracked every transaction, every geological formation, every piece of intelligence Pritchard extracted from her expertise. She was building a weapon, but the weapon was not physical. It was information, comprehensive, precise, and absolutely devastating if deployed correctly. During those 3 years in the mountains, Anna spoke only when necessary. She answered Pritchard's questions about geology, but deflected anything personal. She maintained the cabin, prepared basic meals, conducted surveys when instructed, and otherwise existed in silence that Pritchard interpreted as resignation. He believed he had broken her, that isolation and complete control had reduced her to a compliant tool. He was profoundly mistaken. Anna's silence was not resignation. It was calculation. Every quiet day represented another piece of information gathered, another connection mapped, another future target identified. She was not surviving. She was preparing. The war between the states erupted in April 1861, transforming everything. Pritchard's mining operations became vastly more valuable as both Union and Confederate forces required coal and iron ore for war production. But the conflict also created chaos in property records, legal enforcement, and social order. Pritchard recognized opportunity. He could expand operations dramatically, acquiring more properties while legal oversight remained minimal and prices stayed depressed by wartime uncertainty. But he also recognized risk. If Union forces advanced into Virginia, if Confederate authorities became suspicious of his extensive land transactions, if anyone questioned his relationship with Anna or investigated how he acquired his geological intelligence, consequences could be severe. In June 1861, Pritchard made a decision that would prove fatal to his future. He decided to document Anna's abilities, not comprehensively, but enough to prove to potential investors that his geological intelligence came from legitimate sources. He brought a photographer to the cabin, someone he trusted to maintain discretion. He had Anna demonstrate her survey techniques while the photographer recorded images. Then Pritchard dictated a statement which a clerk transcribed into formal documentation. This woman, designated as property Anna, possesses demonstrated expertise in geological survey and mineral identification. Her abilities have been verified through 3 years of continuous employment, resulting in profitable extraction operations across multiple Virginia properties. Her assessments maintain perfect accuracy rates. Her knowledge represents significant commercial value. Pritchard stored this documentation carefully, intending to use it only if investors demanded proof of his methods. He never showed it to anyone. But the documentation's existence meant something crucial. Physical evidence now connected Pritchard's mining success directly to Anna's expertise. Evidence that would survive even if Anna herself disappeared. Evidence that established clearly, permanently, exactly whose knowledge had generated whose fortune. Anna knew about the documentation. She had been present during its creation. She understood its significance immediately. Pritchard had just created the proof she would eventually need to destroy him. The war years provided Anna with something unexpected, information about the outside world. Pritchard traveled frequently, conducting business in Staunton, Charlottesville, and Richmond. He returned with newspapers which he read aloud to himself in the evenings, processing war news and market information. Anna listened from across the cabin, absorbing everything. Emancipation Proclamation, Union victories, Confederate defeats, the slow grinding collapse of the slave system that had defined her entire existence. She understood what was coming. Freedom, eventual and inevitable. The question was not whether she would be freed, but when, and what condition she would be in when that moment arrived. In early 1864, Pritchard made another crucial error. He brought Anna to Charlottesville for a single day, requiring her presence to survey a property he was considering. It was risky, illegal under Confederate regulations, but Pritchard believed the profit justified the risk. He disguised Anna as his property traveling under his supervision, forged documents claiming legitimate business reasons for her transport. They completed the survey, Anna identified valuable coal deposits, and they returned to the mountains without incident. But during those few hours in Charlottesville, Anna saw something that changed her calculations entirely. She saw free black people. Not many, but enough. Men and women moving through the city, conducting business, working jobs, existing outside the legal framework of slavery. The Confederacy was dying, its control fragmenting, and in that chaos, people were claiming freedom whether or not formal emancipation had reached them. Anna understood immediately she did not need to wait for Union forces to arrive. She did not need Pritchard to grant her freedom. She simply needed to walk away when circumstances made pursuit impossible or irrelevant. That moment was approaching rapidly. By October 1864, Confederate control of Western Virginia had effectively collapsed. Union forces controlled most of the region. Pritchard's mining operations continued, but his ability to enforce any authority over Anna had become questionable. If she walked away, if she simply left the cabin and traveled to Charlottesville or Staunton and claimed to be free, who would stop her? Confederate authorities had more pressing concerns than tracking down one enslaved woman. Union forces would likely support her freedom claim. Pritchard's legal ownership meant nothing if he could not enforce it. Anna waited until November. She chose her moment carefully. Pritchard had traveled to Staunton for a 3-day business meeting with mining company representatives. He left Anna locked in the cabin as he always did during absences, but the locks were simple, and Anna had observed their mechanisms hundreds of times over 3 years. She forced them within minutes, something she could have done at any point, but had chosen not to until the timing was correct. She gathered nothing, took nothing, claimed nothing. She simply walked away from the cabin, descended from the mountains, and traveled to Charlottesville on foot, arriving 2 days later exhausted but free. In Charlottesville, Anna did something remarkable. She did not hide, did not attempt to disguise her identity, did not flee north immediately. Instead, she walked directly to a Union Army administrative office and made a formal statement. She identified herself truthfully, described her circumstances accurately, and requested legal confirmation of her emancipated status. The Union officer she spoke with was skeptical initially. Her educated speech, her precise articulation, her obvious intelligence seemed inconsistent with slavery stereotypes. But Anna produced something unexpected. She offered to demonstrate her geological expertise by surveying a property the Union forces were considering for a supply depot, determining whether the land could support wells and whether building stone existed nearby. The officer accepted more from curiosity than genuine need. Anna spent 2 hours examining the property, then provided a detailed assessment: water table depth, soil composition, presence of sandstone suitable for construction. Her predictions were verified through test excavations the following day. Everything she had claimed proved accurate. The Union officer, now genuinely impressed, issued documentation confirming Anna's free status and suggesting her expertise might prove valuable to reconstruction efforts. More importantly, he recorded her testimony, including her description of James Pritchard's operations, his use of her enslaved labor to generate mining profits, his extensive land holdings acquired through geological intelligence he did not personally possess. Anna now had what she needed: legal freedom, official documentation, and Union Army records that established clearly whose knowledge had built whose fortune. She traveled north in December 1864, reaching Philadelphia by January 1865. The city was chaotic with wartime refugees, emancipated people seeking work, and industries desperate for any expertise that could support Union war production. Anna presented herself to a mining equipment manufacturer, claimed expertise in geological survey, and offered to provide consulting services. The manufacturer was skeptical, obviously. A black woman claiming professional geological knowledge seemed absurd. But Anna made the same offer she had made to the union officer. "Allow me to demonstrate. Send me to any property you are considering. I will provide a survey at no initial cost. If my assessment proves accurate, employ me. If not, you owe me nothing." The manufacturer agreed, expecting failure but risking nothing. Anna surveyed a property in Pennsylvania the company was considering for iron ore extraction. Her assessment indicated substantial deposits at accessible depth. Excavation confirmed her predictions exactly. The manufacturer immediately offered her employment as a technical consultant, a position that paid reasonably and required her expertise but not her presence in the company's daily operations. She accepted, working for them throughout 1865 and into 1866, establishing her reputation and earning income sufficient to support herself independently. By 1867, she had established her own consulting practice, offering geological survey services to multiple companies. Her reputation spread through the mining industry. She became known as someone with uncanny accuracy, someone whose surveys never failed, someone who could identify profitable properties before competitors recognized their value. But Anna was not building a career. She was building a weapon. Every client she acquired, every survey she conducted, every company she advised, she documented carefully. She noted which companies competed with operations that had purchased mineral rights from James Pritchard. She identified men who had profited from her enslaved expertise, tracking their business connections, their current operations, their vulnerabilities. She learned which properties Pritchard had surveyed using her knowledge but had not yet exploited, which mineral deposits remained unmined but documented in his records, which competitors would pay premium prices for intelligence about those formations. She was constructing a complete map of everyone who had prospered from her stolen labor, and she was preparing to systematically dismantle every fortune built on her bondage. In 1868, Anna made her first move. A mining company in Pennsylvania, one that competed directly with an operation that had purchased rights from Pritchard, approached her requesting a survey of a property they were considering. Anna recognized the property immediately. She had surveyed it in 1859 at Pritchard's request. She had identified substantial coal deposits. Pritchard had chosen not to purchase the property because other opportunities seemed more profitable at the time. Anna provided her client with a detailed survey, accurate in every respect, for a price slightly below what comparable consultants charged. Her client acquired the property, exploited the coal deposits profitably, and began competing effectively with the operation that had purchased rights from Pritchard years earlier. That operation's profits declined. Its investors grew concerned. Within a year, the company had sold its holdings at a loss. Anna repeated this pattern with surgical precision. She identified every mining operation that had purchased rights from Pritchard. She provided competing companies with intelligence that allowed them to acquire equivalent or superior properties at lower costs. She gradually undermined every advantage Pritchard's clients had gained from her enslaved expertise. Some companies survived the competition, some did not. But all of them suffered, and the men who had profited from Anna's knowledge without ever compensating her watched their advantages evaporate as mysteriously as they had appeared. Pritchard himself remained Anna's ultimate target, but she approached him patiently. She knew he had continued his speculation operations after the war, though on a reduced scale. She knew he had retained documentation of her abilities, possibly believing it might prove valuable if questions ever arose about his methods. She knew he had acquired significant wealth that would make his eventual destruction more devastating. So she waited, gathering intelligence, tracking his operations, preparing the trap that would close around him when the moment was correct. That moment arrived in 1869 when Pritchard made the mistake of hiring her directly, apparently unaware that his consultant, A. Harrove, who used her former owner's surname ironically, was the same woman he had purchased for $20,000 12 years earlier. If this story is reaching you, if it is making you think about knowledge, power, and the ways people resist oppression, then help us reach others. Hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about Anna's strategic brilliance. Comment below with your thoughts about her approach. Was it justice or revenge? Does that distinction even matter? Your engagement in the first hours helps this story find the audience it deserves. Now, let us return to 1869, to the moment when James Pritchard realized exactly what he had purchased on that March morning in Richmond. Let us return to the coal field that would destroy him. The Pennsylvania property Pritchard had purchased based on Anna's survey looked perfect on paper. Abundant coal, accessible depth, positioned near transportation routes that made extraction and shipping economically viable. Pritchard invested everything, confident that this single property would generate returns sufficient to restore his fortune to its pre-war heights. He had suffered losses during the conflict like most Virginia businessmen, but his post-war operations had been moderately successful. This Pennsylvania coal represented his opportunity to re-establish himself as a major player in the mining industry. He hired workers, purchased equipment, arranged contracts with buyers. Everything proceeded exactly as planned until the buyers began returning the coal. The sulfur contamination was subtle enough to avoid detection during initial testing, but severe enough to make the coal commercially worthless. It burned technically, but the smoke damaged furnaces and sickened anyone exposed to it for extended periods. Industrial buyers refused to accept it. Pritchard's contracts evaporated. His creditors demanded repayment on the loans he had taken to develop the property. His investors, men who had trusted his geological intelligence based on his spectacular pre-war success, demanded explanations for why this catastrophic error had occurred. Pritchard had none. He had trusted his consultant absolutely, believed the survey completely, assumed that Horov's reputation for accuracy meant this assessment would prove as reliable as all previous work. When he confronted Anna in her Philadelphia office, demanding to know how such an error could occur, she provided an answer that destroyed him more thoroughly than the coal field ever could. She reminded him of Richmond, of the price he paid, of the 3 years she spent surveying properties while enslaved, of the documentation he had created connecting his mining success to her expertise. She explained calmly, precisely, exactly what she had done. How she had identified every man, every company, every fortune built on her stolen knowledge. How she had spent 5 years systematically undermining them all. How his bankruptcy was not misfortune, but inevitability, payment for believing that $20,000 purchased ownership of what she knew. Pritchard attempted legal action, obviously. He claimed fraud, breach of contract, deliberate misrepresentation. But Anna's survey had been accurate. Coal existed exactly where she indicated, in the quantity she specified, at the depth she predicted. She had simply omitted information about sulfur contamination because he had not requested it, had not paid for comprehensive chemical analysis, had assumed that her survey would reveal everything relevant, when in fact she had revealed only what his contract specifically required. No court would find fraud when the survey's claims proved literally true. Pritchard had purchased exactly what he paid for, nothing more. The fact that he assumed more was his error, not hers. The bankruptcy proceeded. Pritchard lost everything. His mining empire, built on Anna's enslaved expertise, collapsed into dust. The men who had invested with him, who had trusted his geological intelligence, lost their capital as well. Some of them had been present at the Richmond Exchange in 1857. Some had bid against Pritchard, competing for the privilege of owning Anna's knowledge. All of them now understood that knowledge cannot truly be owned, that intelligence resists control, that buying a human being's labor never grants access to their full capabilities or their ultimate loyalties. They learned this lesson slowly, expensively, and far too late to matter. By 1870, whispers had begun circulating through the mining industry. Not loud accusations, not public scandal, but quiet conversations between men who had lost fortunes and were searching for explanations that made sense. A pattern had emerged, visible only to those willing to look beyond their own misfortune and recognize something larger operating beneath the surface. Mining operations that had prospered in the 1850s were failing with alarming frequency. Companies that had purchased geological intelligence from reputable sources were discovering their advantages had evaporated. Properties that should have generated steady profits were producing inconsistent yields or encountering unexpected complications. And always somewhere in the background, a Philadelphia consultant named A. Horov appeared, providing competing companies with intelligence that undermined whatever advantage the failing operations had possessed. The first person to articulate this pattern publicly was a former mining executive named Robert Dunmore. He had employed Anna briefly in 1856 before the Richmond auction, when she was still being rented out by Marcus Penfield for survey work. Dunmore had been impressed by her abilities then, had bid on her at the exchange the following year, had withdrawn at $5,000 because he could not justify hire. He had watched Pritchard pay $20,000 with a mixture of envy and disbelief. Now 13 years later, Dunmore was retired, living modestly in Richmond and following mining industry news with the attention of someone whose career had been defined by that world. In March 1870, Dunmore published an article in a trade journal called Mining Operations Quarterly. The piece was titled, "The Geological Intelligence Problem," and it presented a careful analysis of mining company failures between 1865 and 1870. Dunmore identified 17 separate operations that had collapsed or suffered significant losses during this period. All 17 had purchased mineral rights or geological intelligence from sources with excellent reputations. All 17 had been undermined by competitors who acquired equivalent or superior properties shortly after the original purchases. And in at least 12 of the 17 cases, the competing companies had employed the same geological consultant, A. Harrove of Philadelphia. Dunmore did not accuse Harrove of fraud or illegal activity. He simply noted the pattern and asked questions that others had apparently not considered. How does one consultant consistently provide intelligence that undermines so many established operations? How does Harrove identify properties that other geologists have missed? What explains the systematic nature of these competitive advantages? Dunmore concluded his article with a statement that would prove more accurate than he possibly imagined. It appears that someone with comprehensive knowledge of Appalachian mineral deposits has decided to share that knowledge selectively, creating advantages for some companies while destroying others. The question is not whether this is occurring, but why, and whether the consultant's motives extend beyond simple profit. The article generated modest attention within mining industry circles. Several executives contacted Dunmore privately, sharing their own experiences with failed operations and Harrove's involvement with their competitors. But no one pursued formal investigation. The mining industry in 1870 was chaotic, still recovering from wartime disruption, and most executives attributed their failures to bad luck or poor management rather than coordinated sabotage. Besides, Harrove's surveys were legitimate. Companies that employed her consultant services received accurate geological intelligence. If that intelligence happened to undermine competitors, well, that was simply how markets operated. Competition was not illegal, even when it proved devastating. But Dunmore could not let the matter rest. He had been present at the Richmond Exchange in 1857. He remembered the woman sold as Lot 37, remembered her unsettling composure, remembered the sealed letter and the mysterious instructions for extracting her knowledge. He began investigating privately, searching for connections between that March morning 13 years earlier and the Philadelphia consultant who seemed to possess comprehensive knowledge of every valuable mineral deposit in Appalachia. The investigation proved difficult. Anna had covered her tracks carefully. She used her former owner's surname, a choice that suggested bitter irony but also created plausible legitimacy. Harrove was a common enough name, and Anna's consulting practice maintained professional standards indistinguishable from any other geological firm. Her clients praised her accuracy. Her surveys were documented thoroughly. Nothing about her business operations suggested anything irregular. Then Dunmore discovered the Union Army records. While researching wartime mineral extraction operations, he found references to a woman who had provided geological consulting to Union forces in Virginia during late 1864 and early 1865. The records identified her as Anna, formerly enslaved, possessing demonstrated expertise in geological survey. The records included testimony describing her previous employment by a land speculator named James Pritchard, who had purchased her in Richmond and used her abilities to identify valuable properties throughout Virginia. Dunmore recognized Pritchard's name immediately. He was the buyer who had called himself Marlowe at the exchange. The buyer who had paid $20,000 for Lot 37. Dunmore traveled to Philadelphia in April 1870, determined to confirm his suspicions. He did not announce his intentions. He simply presented himself at Harrove Geological Consulting, requesting an appointment to discuss potential survey work. The receptionist, a young woman who maintained the office, scheduled a meeting for the following week. When Dunmore arrived for that meeting, he was shown into a modest office where Anna sat behind a desk covered with maps and geological reports. She looked older than he remembered, her face bearing lines that suggested years of outdoor work and calculated stress, but her eyes were identical, calm, intelligent, revealing nothing. Dunmore introduced himself, explained that he was considering a property investment, and requested preliminary assessment of a tract he claimed to own in Western Virginia. Anna listened patiently, asked several technical questions about the property's location and characteristics, and then did something unexpected. She smiled. It was not a warm smile, not friendly, but rather the expression of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment and was pleased it had finally arrived. "You do not own any property in Western Virginia, Mr. Dunmore. You are not here to request a survey. You are here because you have connected Harrove with Lot 37, and you want confirmation." Anna's voice carried no hostility, no defensiveness. She spoke as though discussing routine business matters. Dunmore, caught completely off guard, could only nod. Anna continued, "You published an article about the geological intelligence problem. You documented 17 failed operations. You noticed my involvement with their competitors. You are wondering whether this is deliberate, and if so, why?" Dunmore found his voice. "Is it deliberate?" Anna stood, walked to a filing cabinet, and removed a ledger bound in worn leather. She opened it on the desk between them. Inside, Dunmore saw pages filled with precise handwriting, names, dates, companies, properties, mineral deposits. Years of documentation stretching back to the 1850s. Every survey Anna had conducted while enslaved, every company that had profited from her knowledge, every man who had paid others for her expertise while she received nothing. The ledger continued through the war years and beyond, tracking how those same operations had evolved, who currently owned them, which executives had prospered, which investors had grown wealthy. "This is 23 years of my work," Anna said quietly. "Every geological formation I identified, every coal seam, every iron ore deposit, every limestone quarry, every man who profited from my knowledge while I remained enslaved. After emancipation, I spent 5 years determining who currently controls these operations, who purchased them during the war, who inherited wealth built on my stolen labor. Then I began ensuring that none of them would retain those advantages." Dunmore stared at the ledger, his hands actually shaking. "This is revenge." Anna's expression never changed. "This is payment. Knowledge requires compensation, Mr. Dunmore. You hired me for 1 week in 1856. You paid Marcus Penfield $12. I received nothing. The survey I conducted for you identified a coal seam your company exploited for 3 years, generating approximately $40,000 in profit. You personally received bonuses totaling $8,000 during that period. I received nothing. Your company no longer exists. It failed in 1868 when competitors acquired adjacent properties and undermined your extraction operations. Those competitors employed my consulting services. I charged them reasonable rates and provided accurate intelligence. They compensated me fairly. You did not. The difference in outcomes reflects the difference in treatment." Dunmore's face had gone pale. How many operations have you destroyed?" "I have not destroyed anything," Anna replied calmly. "I have simply ensured that knowledge flows to those willing to pay for it rather than to those who believe they can steal it. 42 companies that profited from my enslaved expertise no longer exist or have suffered significant losses. 173 individual executives, investors, and landowners who grew wealthy using geological intelligence extracted from me without compensation have experienced financial consequences proportional to their previous gains. This is not revenge, Mr. Dunmore. This is accounting. Precise, thorough, and absolutely fair." Dunmore struggled to process what he was hearing. Pritchard. What happened to Pritchard? Anna's smile returned, colder this time. James Pritchard believed $20,000 purchased ownership of my knowledge. He was wrong. It purchased 3 years of my labor under specific conditions. When those conditions ended, when emancipation freed me from legal bondage, our transaction concluded. Everything I learned during those 3 years, every property I surveyed, every formation I identified, that knowledge remained mine. Pritchard kept records, of course, documentation of properties he intended to exploit eventually. I knew about those records. When he hired me in 1869, asking me to survey a Pennsylvania property, I recognized it from his documentation. I provided accurate intelligence about coal deposits. I simply omitted information he had not requested and had not paid to receive. The sulfur contamination was obvious to anyone conducting comprehensive chemical analysis. Pritchard assumed I would provide more than he had contracted for. Assumptions prove expensive, Mr. Dunmore. He lost everything, Dunmore said quietly. He kept everything for 12 years that he purchased using my stolen expertise, Anna corrected. When the debt finally came due, he paid with interest. Some might consider that generous. Dunmore sat in silence for a long moment, his mind racing through implications he was only beginning to understand. Finally, he asked the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Why are you telling me this? Why risk exposure? Anna closed the ledger carefully. Because you published an article asking questions. Because you documented a pattern. Because someone needs to understand what has occurred and why. I am 53 years old, Mr. Dunmore. I have spent more than half my life as property. My knowledge stolen, my labor unpaid, my humanity denied. The remaining years will not be spent hiding what I have accomplished. If the mining industry wishes to investigate me, if executives wish to pursue legal action, if anyone wishes to challenge my consulting practices, they are welcome to try. But they will discover that every survey I have conducted since emancipation has been accurate, every contract fulfilled precisely, every payment rendered fairly. I have broken no laws. I have violated no agreements. I have simply ensured that knowledge flows to those who compensate it rather than those who steal it. She gestured toward the door. You may publish this conversation if you wish. You may warn anyone you choose. But understand something clearly. Everyone who profited from my enslaved expertise, everyone who purchased geological intelligence derived from my stolen labor, they made a choice. They chose to participate in a system that treated human beings as property. They chose to profit from knowledge extracted without compensation. They chose to build their fortunes on my bondage. What has happened to them since is not my responsibility. It is consequence. Long delayed but absolutely inevitable. Robert Dunmore left Anna's office that afternoon and returned to Richmond. He did not publish an account of their conversation. He did not warn anyone in the mining industry. He spent the remaining years of his life, he died in 1901, troubled by questions about complicity, justice, and whether the system that had enriched him had been fundamentally criminal. His private papers, discovered after his death, contained extensive notes documenting Anna's revenge campaign. But those notes also included something else, a confession of sorts, an acknowledgement that he had prospered from her stolen expertise, that the $12 he paid Marcus Penfield in 1856 had generated returns worth tens of thousands, and that he had never once considered compensating the woman whose knowledge made his success possible. But Anna's conversation with Dunmore had consequences neither of them anticipated. Dunmore had shared enough details with other mining executives before traveling to Philadelphia that rumors began spreading. Not loud accusations, but quiet warnings. Be careful hiring Harove. There might be complications. Some companies quietly stopped using her services. Others, particularly smaller operations without connections to the pre-war mining establishment, continued employing her without concern. Anna's consulting practice continued successfully, though her client base gradually shifted from major companies to independent prospectors and new operations without historical ties to slavery-era mineral extraction. By 1875, Anna had accomplished most of what she intended. The fortunes built on her enslaved expertise had been systematically dismantled. The men who had prospered from her stolen knowledge had paid, if not with everything they owned, then at least with enough to understand that theft carried consequences. She continued her consulting work, but the intensity of her campaign diminished. She had proven her point. Knowledge cannot be owned. Intelligence resists control. And those who believe human beings can be purchased, their expertise exploited without compensation, will eventually discover that debt accumulates interest over time. Anna's story should have ended there. A woman who survived slavery, acquired impossible expertise, weaponized that knowledge against her former oppressors, and lived out her remaining years in quiet professional success. But history refuses simple endings, particularly for those whose experiences challenge comfortable narratives. In 1891, a historian named Margaret Holloway began investigating the Richmond Exchange sale of 1857, drawn by the astronomical price and the mystery surrounding Lot 37. Holloway was thorough, persistent, and willing to excavate uncomfortable truths about Virginia's past. She tracked down records, interviewed survivors, and eventually discovered the connection between the woman sold that March morning and the Philadelphia consultant who had systematically destroyed dozens of mining fortunes. Holloway attempted to interview Anna directly. She traveled to Philadelphia in December 1891, located the consulting office, and requested a meeting. But Anna was no longer there. According to the office receptionist, Miss Harrove had retired 6 months earlier, relocating somewhere west, possibly Colorado or California, where mining operations were expanding and geological consultants remained in demand. The receptionist provided no forwarding address and suggested that Miss Harrove had deliberately avoided leaving any traceable connection to her Philadelphia practice. She had simply closed her business, settled all obligations, and vanished as completely as she had vanished from the Richmond Exchange 34 years earlier. Holloway pursued the investigation throughout 1892, gathering fragmentary evidence but never locating Anna herself. She discovered Union Army records confirming Anna's expertise. She found Robert Dunmore's notes documenting the revenge campaign. She tracked down survivors of failed mining operations who remembered Harrove's involvement with their competitors. She pieced together a comprehensive account of how one enslaved woman had acquired geological knowledge, survived systematic exploitation, and then methodically destroyed everyone who had profited from her bondage. But Holloway never published her findings. Her research notes, discovered after her death in 1903, included a final entry dated May 1892 explaining her decision. "I have documented Anna's story as completely as records permit," Holloway wrote. "I have verified her expertise, confirmed her revenge campaign, and established beyond doubt that her knowledge generated fortunes for men who never compensated her. But I have concluded that publication serves no purpose beyond satisfying academic curiosity. Anna has earned her privacy. She survived what should have destroyed her, learned what should have been impossible, and exacted payment from those who believed her bondage meant their prosperity. Publishing her story now would serve only to expose her to continued scrutiny or potential legal harassment from the few surviving members of families whose fortunes she dismantled. Some stories deserve to remain buried until everyone directly involved has died, and only historical truth remains." Margaret Holloway died in 1903. Her research notes were archived, forgotten for decades, and eventually rediscovered by graduate students researching antebellum economic history. By then, everyone involved in Anna's story, Anna herself, James Pritchard, Robert Dunmore, Marcus Penfield, everyone had been dead for years. Only the documentation remained. Ledgers recording impossible prices. Survey reports demonstrating impossible accuracy. Union Army testimony confirming impossible expertise. And questions that still lack comfortable answers. How does an enslaved woman acquire professional geological knowledge in a society designed to prevent education? How does someone treated as property develop expertise that surpasses trained scientists? How does a person who legally owned nothing accumulate intellectual capital sufficient to destroy dozens of fortunes? The answers matter less than what they reveal. Intelligence flourishes regardless of circumstances. Knowledge resists every attempt at control. And those who believe they can own what others know, who assume that legal bondage means genuine power, will eventually learn that the debt always comes due. Anna understood this from the beginning. From that March morning in Richmond when she stood on the auction block worth $20,000 in men's estimation but priceless in reality. From those 3 years in the mountains when James Pritchard believed isolation meant control. From the moment of emancipation when chains fell away and the weapon she had been forging silently for 13 years became fully operational. The question of where Anna went after leaving Philadelphia in 1891 remained unanswered for nearly 60 years. Margaret Holloway's investigation had concluded with that receptionist's vague statement about Colorado or California, about new mining territories where geological expertise remained valuable. But no records confirmed Anna's presence in either location. No consulting firms listed anyone matching her description. No mining operations reported employing a woman geologist of her age and background. She had vanished as completely as though she had never existed, leaving behind only the wreckage of demolished fortunes and questions that historians could not resolve. Then in 1947, during renovation of a commercial building in Denver, construction workers discovered something extraordinary behind a false wall in what had once been a private office. An iron strong box sealed with a lock that had rusted through decades of neglect. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from moisture, were 3 leather-bound ledgers and a single envelope addressed to no one, marked only with instructions to be opened by whoever finds this, whenever that might occur. What follows is the complete accounting. The ledgers contained Anna's comprehensive documentation of 23 years of geological work. The first ledger covered 1847 through 1857, recording every survey she conducted while enslaved, every property examined, every mineral deposit identified, every company and individual who profited from her expertise. The entries were written in precise handwriting, each one noting the date, location, geological formations observed, and the names of those who received the intelligence without compensating her. The detail was staggering. She had remembered everything with perfect clarity, documenting it all once she gained freedom and the ability to write openly. The second ledger covered 1857 through 1864, the years with James Pritchard. Here the documentation became even more meticulous. Every property Pritchard had her survey, every mineral deposit she identified, every mining company that purchased rights based on her assessments, every dollar Pritchard earned from her stolen expertise. She had tracked it all mentally during those 3 years in the mountains, then committed it to paper once emancipation freed her. The ledger included something else as well. Financial calculations showing exactly how much wealth each transaction generated, how much Pritchard paid in acquisition costs, and the profit margins he achieved. It was an accountant's rendering of theft, precise and damning. The third ledger covered 1865 through 1891, documenting Anna's consulting career and her systematic campaign to redistribute the advantages stolen from her. But this ledger revealed something historians had not understood about Anna's motivations. Her revenge against individual men and companies was not the ultimate goal. It was merely the first phase of something larger. Anna had not simply destroyed fortunes built on her enslaved expertise. She had redirected that wealth systematically toward a specific purpose. The ledger showed that Anna had taken meticulous care in selecting which companies to support with her consulting services after emancipation. She had not chosen randomly or based solely on who would pay her. She had selected companies owned or operated by black entrepreneurs, by women, by immigrants, by anyone systematically excluded from the mining industry's traditional power structures. She had provided them with geological intelligence at reduced rates, sometimes at cost, ensuring they could compete effectively against established operations built on slavery-era profits. And when those companies succeeded, when they acquired valuable properties and generated wealth, Anna had negotiated agreements where a percentage of their profits would be directed towards specific causes. The ledger documented these arrangements with the same precision she applied to everything else. Funds directed towards schools for formerly enslaved people, investments in black-owned businesses, contributions to organizations fighting for civil rights and economic justice. Anna had not kept the money she earned from her consulting practice. She had weaponized it, transforming stolen expertise into systematic wealth redistribution. Over 26 years, she had redirected approximately $400,000, an astronomical sum, from mining profits into communities that had been deliberately excluded from economic opportunity. The fortune men like Pritchard had accumulated through her enslaved labor was not destroyed. It was redistributed to those who had been denied the chance to accumulate wealth themselves. But the envelope contained something even more remarkable, a letter written in 1891 explaining why Anna had chosen to disappear and what she hoped her documentation would accomplish if ever discovered. The letter was addressed to no one specifically, written for whoever might eventually find it, and it provided the closest thing to Anna's own voice that historians would ever access. "My name was never Anna," the letter began. "That was a name imposed during childhood, assigned by someone who owned me, and I accepted it because resistance to small indignities conserves energy for larger battles. I do not remember the name I was given at birth. I was 3 years old when I was sold away from my mother, and whatever name she called me was lost in the violence of that separation. So I will not sign this letter with any name because names given by others carry no authority and names I might choose for myself matter only to me. What matters is what I accomplished and why. And what I hope those who discover this will understand about knowledge, power, and the long arithmetic of justice. I was educated by accident. Colonel Harov's wife taught me to read because she believed literacy represented a form of resistance, a way of asserting humanity in a system designed to deny it. She was correct, but she did not understand the full implications. Once I could read, once I had access to her husband's geological library, I acquired something more dangerous than literacy. I acquired expertise, specialized knowledge valuable enough to transform me from disposable labor into expensive property. From someone worth perhaps $800 as a field hand into someone worth $20,000 as geological intelligence. This transformation was not liberation. It was a different form of bondage, perhaps more insidious because it disguised exploitation as opportunity. Men like Colonel Harov, like Marcus Penfield, like James Pritchard, they believed they were being clever. They recognized that my knowledge had value and they found ways to extract that value while maintaining complete control over me. They believed this arrangement was sustainable. They were wrong. Knowledge is different from labor. Physical labor can be extracted through violence and supervision. You can force someone to plant tobacco or dig coal or process cotton. But knowledge requires cooperation. It requires the person who possesses it to share it accurately, completely, honestly. The moment they choose to withhold information, to provide partial truths, to share intelligence selectively, control evaporates. And enslaved people, people who spent every day of their lives navigating a system designed to exploit them, we understood this better than our owners ever could. I cooperated completely during my enslavement because cooperation served my interests. Every survey I conducted, every mineral deposit I identified, I documented mentally with perfect accuracy. I was building two things simultaneously. I was building my value, making myself expensive enough that careful treatment became economically rational. And I was building a complete map of who profited from my expertise. Knowledge I would eventually use once circumstances changed. The men who employed me, who rented my services, or purchased me outright, they saw only the immediate transaction. I saw decades ahead, calculating precisely how their advantage would become their vulnerability. When emancipation came, when the legal framework supporting my bondage collapsed, I did not celebrate immediately. I recognized that legal freedom without economic power meant continued subjection. So I used the one asset I possessed, the comprehensive knowledge I had accumulated through 13 years of geological survey. I established myself as a consultant, charging fair rates, conducting accurate surveys, building a reputation for reliability. And then I systematically dismantled every fortune built on my enslaved expertise. This was not revenge in the emotional sense. It was accounting, precise, thorough, and absolutely fair. Every man who profited from my stolen knowledge lost advantages proportional to what they had gained. Some lost everything. Some lost only part of their wealth. The calculations were exact. I kept records. I ensured that payment matched debt with interest accumulated over years of unpaid labor. But destruction alone accomplishes nothing. Revenge without purpose is merely cruelty, and I had no interest in replicating the cruelty that defined my enslavement. So simultaneously, I redirected wealth. I ensured that companies owned by those who had been systematically excluded from opportunity received the geological intelligence they needed to compete. I negotiated arrangements where their success generated funding for schools, businesses, organizations fighting for justice. I transformed stolen expertise into systematic redistribution, not charity, payment long overdue, but finally rendered. By 1891, I had accomplished what I intended. The major fortunes built on my enslaved knowledge had been dismantled or significantly diminished. Approximately $400,000 had been redirected toward communities that needed it. My consulting practice had established that a black woman could succeed in a profession dominated entirely by white men, not through exceptional treatment, but through demonstrated expertise that could not be denied. I had proven that knowledge resists ownership, that intelligence cannot be controlled through legal bondage, that those who exploit others' expertise will eventually pay for it. So I chose to disappear, not because I feared consequences, legal action, or retribution, but because continued visibility served no purpose. My story was never supposed to become public inspiration. It was supposed to be private accounting, a personal settling of debts that others never knew existed. If this documentation is ever discovered, if someone reads these ledgers and this letter, I hope they understand something fundamental. The system that enslaved me, that treated human beings as property, that enabled theft of knowledge and labor without compensation, that system enriched thousands of people who never acknowledged their complicity. What I did to a few dozen men and companies represents a fraction of what justice would actually require. Every fortune in America built before 1865 should be examined for its connection to slavery. Every business that prospered, every family that accumulated wealth, every institution that thrived during that period, they should be required to document precisely how enslaved labor contributed to their success. And then payment should be rendered, not symbolic gestures, not historical acknowledgement, actual payment, comprehensive, proportional, and mandatory. This will never happen, of course. The people who profited most from slavery or whose ancestors profited will resist any accounting. They will claim historical distance, changed circumstances, inability to quantify harm. They will argue that they personally did nothing wrong, that inherited wealth carries no moral obligation, that the past should remain in the past. These arguments are convenient lies. Stolen wealth remains stolen regardless of how much time passes. Unpaid debts do not expire simply because the creditor dies. And knowledge extracted through bondage does not become legitimate through subsequent use. I have done what one person could do. I documented my own exploitation comprehensively. I settled my accounts with precision. I redirected stolen wealth toward those who needed it. I proved that intelligence survives oppression, that knowledge becomes power even when that power must be exercised secretly, patiently over decades. If others discover this documentation and choose to examine their own histories, their own institutions, their own inherited advantages, then perhaps my accounting will inspire broader examination. If not, then at least the record exists. The truth has been preserved. And somewhere in communities I supported, in schools I funded, in businesses I helped establish, the effects of my work continue, even though my name, whatever name I might have chosen, will remain forever unknown. The letter wasn't signed. The 3 ledgers and the envelope were donated to the Library of Congress in 1948, where they were cataloged, archived, and largely forgotten for another 30 years. Then, in the late 1970s, during renewed academic interest in slavery's economic dimensions, researchers rediscovered them. The documentation Anna had created became foundational evidence for understanding how enslaved people's intellectual contributions shaped American economic development, how systematic theft of expertise generated wealth that persisted across generations, and how resistance could take forms far more sophisticated than physical rebellion. But Anna herself remained unknowable. The documentation showed what she accomplished, but revealed almost nothing about who she was beyond her expertise and her determination to settle accounts. No one ever confirmed where she went after leaving Philadelphia. No death certificate was ever located. No grave marker bore any name that could be connected to her. She vanished completely, deliberately, as though understanding that historical erasure could be chosen rather than imposed. She had spent decades making herself valuable to those who wished to exploit her, then making herself invisible once that exploitation ended. The disappearance was final, absolute, and perhaps exactly what she intended. The Denver building where her documentation was discovered had been constructed in 1892. Property records indicated it was originally financed through a company owned by 3 black businessmen, brothers who had established a successful mining supply operation in Colorado. Their company had prospered unusually quickly, acquiring valuable contracts and expanding into multiple cities within 5 years. After Anna's ledgers were discovered and examined, historians found references to a geological consultant who had provided the brothers with intelligence about suppliers, markets, and mining operations that needed equipment. The consultant had charged minimal fees, asking only that a percentage of future profits be directed toward educational initiatives in predominantly black communities. The brothers had honored this agreement for decades, establishing scholarships, funding schools, supporting black-owned businesses. When the last of the 3 brothers died in 1931, his will included instructions that a sealed package be placed behind a false wall in their original Denver office with a note indicating it should remain there until time and circumstance reveal what was deliberately hidden. That package contained Anna's ledgers and her letter. The brothers had known who she was. They had protected her identity, and they had ensured her accounting would eventually be discovered. But only after everyone directly involved had died, and historical truth could emerge without threatening anyone's safety. Modern analysis of Anna's ledgers confirmed the extraordinary scope of her accomplishment. Between 1865 and 1891, she had surveyed more than 300 properties across 7 states. She had provided geological intelligence to 42 different companies, most owned by people systematically excluded from the mining industry's traditional power structures. The wealth generated from these surveys and subsequently redistributed according to Anna's arrangements exceeded $1 million by 1920. Schools she helped fund educated thousands of students who would otherwise have been denied opportunity. Businesses she supported employed hundreds of workers and generated economic stability in communities that had been deliberately impoverished. The effects rippled forward across generations, invisible to those who benefited, but absolutely real in their impact. If you've stayed with this story, if Anna's calculated brilliance and patient justice have moved you, then this channel needs your support. Hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how resistance can look like cooperation, how knowledge becomes power, how the long arithmetic of justice operates across decades. Comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Anna's approach was justified? Should stolen wealth always be repaid regardless of time passed? Your engagement helps stories like this reach people who need to hear them. Subscribe to the Fear Sermon. Hit that notification bell because we excavate exactly these kinds of buried truths. These stories about people who refuse to accept what history tried to impose on them. The mining industry Anna knew, the fortunes she systematically dismantled, the system that enslaved her and thousands of others, all of it has evolved beyond recognition. But the fundamental questions her story raises remain absolutely current. How do we account for wealth built on stolen labor? What obligation do those who inherit advantages created through exploitation have to those whose exploitation generated those advantages? How long does debt persist? When does stolen become legitimate simply through passage of time? Anna answered these questions for herself with precision that would satisfy any accountant. Debt persists forever until payment is rendered. Stolen never becomes legitimate. Those who inherit advantages built on exploitation inherit the obligation to pay. She executed this accounting personally, targeting specific men and companies whose prosperity derived directly from her bondage. But her letter makes clear she understood the limitations of individual action. Comprehensive justice would require systematic examination of every fortune, every institution, every inherited advantage created during slavery. It would require payment proportional to harm, redistribution proportional to theft, accountability that extends across generations because effects extend across generations. This has not happened. It will likely never happen, at least not with the comprehensiveness Anna's accounting demanded. But her story demonstrates that individual resistance matters even when systemic change remains elusive. That one person armed with expertise and determination and perfect memory can alter the trajectories of dozens of fortunes. That knowledge cannot be owned. Intelligence cannot be controlled. And those who believe bondage means genuine power will discover otherwise. Eventually. The discovery might take years, decades, generations, but it arrives. The debt comes due and payment when finally rendered carries interest accumulated across all the years when creditors waited for what was owed. Anna was 53 years old when she disappeared from Philadelphia in 1891. If she lived another 20 years, she would have reached 73, dying sometime around 1911. If she lived 30 years, she would have witnessed the beginning of World War I, the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance's early stirrings. We will never know. The only certainty is that she chose to vanish, to protect her privacy, to prevent her story from becoming public spectacle during her lifetime. She had accomplished what she intended, settled her accounts, redistributed stolen wealth, proved that intelligence survives oppression, and knowledge becomes power when wielded with sufficient patience and precision. The woman who stood on the Richmond Exchange auction block on March 14, 1857, worth $20,000 in the estimation of men who believed human beings could be bought and sold, she understood something her purchasers never grasped. Price and value are not synonymous. Legal ownership does not grant genuine control. And knowledge, once acquired, becomes a weapon more powerful than any physical force, precisely because its effects remain invisible until long after the damage has been done. James Pritchard paid $20,000 believing he was purchasing geological expertise. What he actually purchased was his own eventual destruction, delivered with patience that spanned 12 years and precision that left him bankrupt and broken. Every other man who profited from Anna's enslaved knowledge learned the same lesson, though most never understood why their advantages evaporated or where their competitors acquired superior intelligence. The lesson persists beyond those specific men, beyond the antebellum mining industry, beyond even the institution of slavery itself. Knowledge resists every attempt at control. Intelligence flourishes regardless of circumstances. And those who build prosperity on others' exploitation, who inherit advantages created through bondage, who benefit from systems designed to steal expertise without compensation, they accumulate debt whether they acknowledge it or not. That debt persists across generations because harm persists across generations. And eventually, somewhere, someone with enough determination and perfect memory will begin the accounting. The payment might not come from those who benefited most. It might not be proportional to the original theft, but it will come. The debt always comes due eventually. Anna's story ends in silence and disappearance. No grave marker, no memorial, no public acknowledgement beyond academic documentation in archives most people will never examine. She erased herself as completely as history tried to erase her, but for different reasons. Not because she was powerless, but because she had accomplished everything she intended and saw no value in celebrity or recognition. She had transformed from property worth $20,000 into a force that redistributed more than $1 million across communities that needed it. She had demonstrated that one person, armed with expertise and determination, could alter the trajectories of fortunes and institutions. She had settled her accounts with precision that would satisfy the most meticulous accountant. And then she walked away, disappearing into the vast American landscape where people could reinvent themselves, choosing privacy over recognition, silence over spectacle, completion over continued struggle. Somewhere in Colorado or California or some other Western territory where mining boomed in the 1890s, an elderly woman might have lived quietly, perhaps still consulting occasionally on geological matters, perhaps simply existing in the peace that comes from knowing debts have been settled and justice, however incomplete and individual, has been achieved. Or perhaps she died soon after leaving Philadelphia, her work complete, her energy exhausted by decades of calculated resistance. We will never know. The documentation she left behind reveals everything about what she accomplished and nothing about who she was beyond her expertise and her determination. That might be exactly what she wanted. To be remembered not as a person but as proof that knowledge survives oppression, that intelligence cannot be owned, that those who exploit others' expertise will eventually pay for it. To be remembered not through sentiment but through ledgers that document precisely how wealth was stolen and precisely how it was redistributed. To be remembered not with sympathy but with understanding that resistance takes many forms, that justice operates across decades, and that the long arithmetic of exploitation always demands payment. The highest-priced enslaved woman ever auctioned in the American South was never property despite what the law claimed. She was never owned despite what the bill of sale certified. She was never controlled despite $20,000 paid and 3 years of isolation in the mountains. She was knowledge itself, patient and precise and absolutely merciless. And when the chains finally fell away, when emancipation transformed legal status, the weapon she had been forging silently for 13 years became fully operational. What followed was not revenge in any emotional sense. It was accounting, perfect, thorough, and absolutely fair. The kind of accounting that persists in ledgers discovered 60 years later behind false walls waiting to remind us that stolen wealth remains stolen, that unpaid debts do not expire, and that knowledge once acquired becomes power that no legal bondage can control or contain. This is what happened to the woman who sold for an impossible price in Richmond in 1857. This is where she went, what she did, and why the question of her location after 1891 matters less than the question of what her story reveals about knowledge, power, and the long memory of exploitation. She disappeared because her work was complete. The accounting was finished. The debt had been collected. And somewhere in America, in schools she funded and businesses she supported and communities she strengthened, her knowledge continues generating value, not for those who tried to own it, but for those who had been systematically denied the opportunity to accumulate knowledge and wealth themselves. That redistribution, that careful redirection of stolen expertise toward those who needed it most, that might be the most devastating revenge of all. Not destruction, but transformation. Not elimination of wealth, but transfer of it to hands that would use it justly. Not erasure of the past, but accounting for it with precision that leaves no doubt about who owes what to whom. The debt always comes due. The payment always arrives. And knowledge, regardless of who believes they own it, belongs to those who possess it and choose to share it, withhold it, or weaponize it according to their own calculations of justice. Anna understood this from the beginning, from that March morning when she stood on the auction block worth $20,000. From those 3 years when James Pritchard believed isolation meant control. From the moment when emancipation freed her legally and her ledgers freed her actually. She understood that knowledge creates leverage, that intelligence survives oppression, and that the long arithmetic of justice operates on timelines measured in decades rather than days. She was patient. She was precise. She was absolutely merciless in her accounting. And when she finally disappeared, she left behind proof that one person, given enough determination and perfect memory, can settle debts that entire systems tried to ignore. The fierce sermon of history contains many such stories waiting to be opened, examined, and understood. This was one of them. There are others, and we will continue excavating them one buried truth at a time.